Hey, deserving listeners. So I didn't really expect this, but I received a lot of emails in response to my episodes on baby reindeer. And upon reading some of them, I thought I have to share these emails with y'all. Some of these emails are extremely interesting. This first email is from listener Susan. She says, I stalked a therapist for years by phone. I stalked a therapist. I'm assuming her own therapist. I'm not sure. I stalked a therapist for years by phone. I was so angry with him, and I knew I was extremely ill, but I could do nothing about it. I knew I was extremely ill, but I couldn't do anything about it. Your video explains my behavior so well. It's providing me with another stepping stone of understanding towards improving myself. I stalked this poor therapist online through a psychology forum. I would write terrible things about him, and other people on the forum were responding to me with understanding. On the forum, we supported each other in our combined madnesses and therapy transference love. So just chiming in here, I think what Susan is saying is that her and everybody else on this forum, or a lot of the people on the forum, were experiencing transference love for their therapists, in that we will tend to transfer our important, significant past relationships, often with our parents. We will transfer that relationship onto our therapist. We will displace, and we will see our therapist as if they are the person in our past, even though the therapist isn't doing anything that would justify that. We might have an abusive parent, and then we might feel abused by our therapist, and that's what we call transference or displacement. And it's confusing, but it's a part of therapy, and it's normal. It happens all the time. Sometimes clients might fall in love with their therapists. So Susan is saying that they were all on this forum encouraging each other regarding that distortion, regarding transferring onto the therapist. Going on, we all had an addiction to our therapists, and we were all suffering. Yeah. At the time, my family and my life were literally falling apart around me, and I had one of those childhoods that produced my type of personality. I think she's referring to narcissistic personality, as well as, I suspect, a strong genetic predisposition to borderline personality disorder and the associated narcissistic traits. I was so angry at the time. I felt like a fish caught in a net, thrashing for my life. End of email. Yeah, well, thanks for sharing, Susan. I always appreciate getting emails or comments along these lines. You know, it's one thing for me to make a video about a stalker and a victim and have victims step forward, which is very, very important to me. It is literally the meaning of my life to help validate and inform around that. But for perpetrators to step forward, perpetrators of abuse, perpetrators of stalking, for them to step forward, well, that is the icing on the cake. Because when I talk, I'm getting chills thinking about when I talk about these syndromes, these patterns, I'm not only hoping to validate the victims out there of various different kinds, but I'm also hoping that I myself can reach perpetrators, people who harm others, because our society doesn't talk to perpetrators in a way that is inviting. I'm not justifying the behavior, of course, but I think I am providing a way of conceptualizing why a good person would do a very, very bad thing, even if that very, very bad thing lasted for years. Why would a good person do a very, very bad thing? Well, there's various reasons. Of course, there are also very, very bad people. I mean, what's good, what's bad, but, sadistic psychopaths that are beyond repair, that kind of thing. Those people exist. I've met those people. I've treated some of those people. It's terrifying to be around them. But the vast majority of people are not that. contrary to our society and the way the internet talks about people who abuse or stalk as being rotten to the core. They might not say that phrase, but I think they believe it to be true. So if we're going to actually change society for the better, then what better way than to help the perpetrators? And if we're going to help the perpetrators, then we have to reach out to them in a way that, at the very least, isn't making them out to be evil. So I'm glad that you are going down the path. It sounds like you were already on that path, and watching my videos was a small part of that, a stepping stone, as you say, which is just fantastic. All right, this next email is from anonymous annual patron and YouTube member. She says, could you please discuss why you classified Martha as having narcissistic personality disorder rather than borderline personality disorder? So just chiming in here. Well, first off, I hope that I didn't classify Martha as having anything because I can't diagnose from afar. I hope I said that my top hypothesis would be narcissism, but I would need a lot more information to confidently diagnose her with anything. So I hope I said that. But if we go with that, why wasn't my top hypothesis borderline? The other thing to consider is that clinicians are going to vary regarding their opinions. I have seen this firsthand many, many times in my life, particularly around personality disorders. So why didn't I say borderline? Well, in a nutshell, I see borderline and narcissism to be very, very similar. I've talked about this before, that underneath every narcissistic person is a borderline person, in that both, in my conceptualization, and the research points in this direction, and my clinical experience shows me this, that narcissistic people and borderline people both went through a lot of attachment injury when they were very, very young. And I could go into the nuances on this, and you can listen to my deep dives, but when you have significant attachment injury early in life, it can result in a lot of different issues that we might label as personality disorders or attachment styles or whatever, delineating between those syndromes or those reactions or those adaptations that children and then adults will have in response to the trauma that they went through can be hard. It can be hard to say, is this borderline or is it narcissism? Because the underlying issue is still the same. They went through a very, very difficult time and they had to adapt. And might someone adapt in a way where they look like both, depending on the day? Yeah. So could someone say borderline and make a case for it? Absolutely. The bottom line is, without going into all the details, the criteria of narcissism were closer in my view. Like, one of the things she said when they were in the canal, she says something along the lines of, any man who doesn't want to be with me, any man who isn't attracted to me, is either blind or gay. That's a very grandiose statement. And people with borderline don't typically have that grandiosity. People with borderline typically have very low self-esteems, contrary to evidence around them. Whereas narcissistic people tend to have, at least on the surface, their narcissistic structure is such that they believe that they're the most wonderful person, depending on the domain that they're focusing on. In that moment, Martha thought that every man would want her. That's not a borderline thing typically. It's a narcissistic thing. But I see why people would think borderline, because we see the vulnerability. But people with narcissism are vulnerable. That's why I say underneath every narcissistic person is a borderline person. The problem, though, is that borderline people will try to get attachment with others and might get some occasionally. Narcissistic people have avoided it their whole life. So they haven't gotten it in the same way that borderline people haven't gotten it, and they haven't searched for it. So they are really, really alone and very, very fragile and very, very much in pain. So that's that. Another reason why I went with narcissism is that whenever someone presents with symptoms or behaviors within the realm of cluster B, histrionic, borderline, and narcissistic, if it's a woman, they will be categorized as borderline, and if they're a man, they'll be categorized as narcissistic. And I was welcoming the opportunity to talk about a narcissistic woman character in Martha. to dispel of that stereotype. Because believe me, plenty of people who suffer from narcissism are women. Going on with your email, you say, I've seen other mental health practitioners online suggest that she suffered from erotomania, delusional disorder, and bipolar. End of email. Yeah, well, some are suggesting this, and I have to say I'm confused. In fact, a lot of people, even in the comment section, were clinicians, I think, saying delusional disorder or bipolar. And so you could make kind of an argument for delusional disorder, but it's better, the distortion that she had, that she was in a relationship with Donnie, is better explained through narcissistic personality disorder, particularly because a lot of the other symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder were there. Plus, when you actually see people with erotomania and delusional disorder, it's much more akin to schizophrenia. That's how it's categorized. That's how it's described. It's not schizophrenia, but it is much more like that. And a lot of people with delusional disorder will develop schizophrenia. So I didn't see that in her. The only scene where we saw that was when Donnie broke up with her, right? They weren't in a relationship, but Donnie breaks up with her. And she's like, oh no, don't break up with me. And you're thinking, huh? Why do you think that you actually believe? And here's my opinion. When I saw that scene, I thought, even though I knew it was based on a true story, I thought that Richard Gadd had embellished that scene. I wouldn't be surprised if he would say, yeah, I kind of amped that scene up a little bit for drama's sake or something. Or I condensed a bunch of things into that one scene, and that seemed like it fit. Because none of the other presentation, the way that it was written and presented, fit into that delusional category. Like, there was an earlier scene where he, in the very beginning of episode 1, after she is ramping up and talking, and she brings in that picnic basket. She's like, oh, we could have this romantic time on my birthday. And he says, look, Martha, I think picnic is something that boyfriend and girlfriend would do, right? And the way Martha reacts is she immediately realizes that she has overstepped. And she says, oh, well, what would friends do? And he says, go to a coffee shop? And then they go to a coffee shop. If she were delusional, she would not have reacted that way. When you confront a delusion, you don't get that reaction. She adjusted, which pointed at the reality that for her, she knew she wasn't in a relationship with him, but she was hoping to be in a relationship with him, and she liked playing house, kind of. Because it wasn't like she was going home with him or trying to kiss him or hug him or anything. She just liked, it's like playing house. It's like, we're going to pretend, and I want to pretend. Can't we just pretend? And then when he confronted that, she was like, oh, bummer. I guess we can't pretend. Well, can we be friends? That's not someone suffering from a delusion. That's someone that's making a choice. It's someone that is desperate, and it's not typical to narcissism, but it definitely is something that I've seen before. The other thing about delusional disorder is that lifetime prevalence of delusional disorder, of all the different types, including erotomania, is something like 0.2%. So that's 2 out of every 1,000 people, right, will, according to research, suffer from delusional disorder in general, all the different types of delusional disorder. Erotomania is just one of the types, one of the several types of delusional disorder. So let's just back of the napkin say, and this is probably too many, but let's say 1 out of every 10 people who have delusional disorder have erotomania. Well, then that puts the lifetime prevalence rate of erotomania to be 0.02%, 2 out of every 10,000 people, right? Well, the lifetime prevalence rate of narcissistic personality disorder is a little less than 2%. So that means that there are 100 times more people with narcissistic personality, full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. We're not even including the people that are on the spectrum, right? So there are 100 times more people who suffer from narcissistic personality disorder than there are who suffer from erotomania. So if I see enough narcissistic traits and I can explain the delusion-like behavior, it's sort of like with borderline. The classic pre-treatment, pre-awareness for someone with borderline is they'll text their partner while they're at work, and their partner won't text them back. And the individual, the borderline individual, will start spinning out of control, and fast forward a few hours, and without any reason to believe so, they believe that their husband or their partner is cheating on them, even though that's just not a possibility. That's, you could argue, a delusion, but we don't frame it that way. But that is why it's called borderline, because originally, before they knew about borderline, they observed some people seem to have these like very specific delusions, breaks from reality, but it wasn't schizophrenia. It was something different. It's borderline schizophrenia. It's borderline psychotic. Eventually, they figured out that these distortions were related to attachment injury, in that they're so paranoid about abandonment, and they've been abandoned so many times that they see abandonment where it doesn't exist, and they will fit the facts around their feeling, which is that their partner is cheating on them. So for the narcissistic person, they also have borderline schizophrenic-like distortions, that they're superior, that they're wonderful, that everyone loves them, that anyone who isn't attracted to them is either blind or gay, and that someone who talks to them is secretly in love with them. Okay, so let's talk about bipolar, because that was also something I saw in the comments section, and this anonymous patron and YouTube member is saying that she has seen other clinicians online saying that Martha has bipolar. I don't understand this, because if you've actually met someone with bipolar, you would not think Martha was bipolar. Since the beginning of my career, I have seen people apply the label of bipolar to people that I have no idea where they are coming from. Bipolar is a very specific presentation. There are variations, but the quintessential presentation, which I would think is the majority of presentations, the vast majority, is depressed for several months and then manic for a few weeks. And depression, most people know what that is. Mania is very particular. I could describe mania to you. You could hear it. You could read the symptoms list. You'd never really know what it is until you actually see it. It's so different than I think everyone can kind of know what because all of us have been a little depressed. But manic is like a whole other ball of wax. And it's very particular, and it's very noticeable. And there were zero signs of Martha. I mean, someone could make the argument that she might have suffered from bipolar, but we just never saw on screen, because like off screen, she would have the full-blown manic episodes, or maybe she was bipolar too. And but you'd really have to shove it in there. And, if Martha were a real character, is it possible? Yeah, because we just don't have a lot of data. But in terms of the data that was presented on the show, I didn't see any sign. I think the only thing that people were keying in on was that she talked a lot, and they just think people who talk a lot are manic. But a lot of different people talk a lot, not just manic people. Plus, when manic people are talking a lot, half the time, particularly as they escalate in mania, they don't make any sense. Also, the kinds of things that manic people will talk about, I don't want to get in the weeds. I just want to say, to me, it didn't look like bipolar at all. And it's just another example of how sometimes I wonder if I'm stupid, or we all learned from different professors, or I don't know. I just don't understand why. Because I had a client who had borderline, and he went to the hospital. He went to the emergency room, and he was diagnosed with bipolar within 20 minutes and given lithium. And he came into session, and he's like, yeah, so I had sort of a bad weekend because of this and that, and I went to the emergency room, and they diagnosed me with bipolar, and they gave me lithium. Do I have bipolar? And I've been treating this client for years, and I was like, no, you don't have bipolar. Presumably, my client was assessed by a very qualified individual, hopefully, and yet, how could they miss the mark? I don't know. A fad? I've seen people just throw bipolar. Like I once had a 6-year-old client who had a huge anger problem, and he was diagnosed with bipolar, and I didn't see any cycles. Now, I will mention that there are mixed cycles and rapid cycling. That's a very complicated area to get into. You could make an argument, I suppose, that Martha had some sort of mixed rapid cycle version of bipolar. But I don't know. To me, it just feels like it's really stretching it. I'm willing to be proven wrong. I'm willing for people to make a case for it. I'd love to hear it, honestly. But let's go on to another email. Anonymous long-term annual patron. She says, I was initially put on the defensive while listening to your baby reindeer episodes because of my own disorganized and preoccupied attachment. I was initially put on the defensive while listening to your baby reindeer episodes because of my own disorganized and preoccupied attachment. Okay. In dating, I've always moved on quickly when it didn't work out. But with my most recent breakup, I was very in love with him in a way I'd never experienced before, and I had a really hard time letting go. So it sounds like the patron is saying that she felt the urge similar to what Martha was doing. I'm not sure. I'll continue reading. I've always felt a bit resentful when you talk about the risk for preoccupied people to hold their avoidant counterparts hostage. I've always felt a bit resentful when you, talking to me, when you talk about the risk for preoccupied people to hold their avoidant counterparts hostage. Chiming in, I hope I never used that term, that they would hold avoidant people hostage. I mean, I guess depending on what I was saying or the context, I don't think I would word it that way. But yeah, there's a risk of for preoccupied people to deal with the pain and the anxiety by becoming controlling. That's just a fact. Do they all do that? No. Can avoidant people be controlling? Yeah. Can secure people be controlling? Yeah. But preoccupied people. But I wouldn't ever say seriously that preoccupied people hold their avoidant counterparts hostage. I mean, that is extreme, and that's not how I think. If I said that, I apologize. Why is it seen as such a violation to want to be with someone intensely, but not to completely rip a person's heart out? Why is it seen as such a violation to want to be with someone intensely, but not to completely rip a person's heart out? Just chiming in. Yeah, I mean, anonymous long-term annual patron, if you were, for the first time, you're saying, very much in love with someone, and when you went through the breakup, you had a really hard time letting go, and you didn't want to say goodbye. And you say, you want to be with them intensely. And you might have pursued them intensely. That's not a violation. That's just normal. I mean, it's normal for anyone. If you're secure and you go through a rough breakup, then you're probably going to have moments of intense desire to, even if you were the one breaking up with someone, you might have an intense desire to get back with them. It's just normal. You miss them, or you don't want to say goodbye, particularly if you're the one being broken up with. Going on. It's totally fine to tell someone they're safe with you only to disappear and make them feel very unsafe. It's totally fine I'm not sure with that. So all of this was swirling around in my head when I was listening to your Baby Reindeer episodes. But I think your episodes, coupled with watching the show, Baby Reindeer, finally helped it click for me. Obviously, I understand logically that it wasn't okay to stalk him, but I was able to empathize with the avoidant person a lot more than I have in the past. I think she's referring to Donnie. I identified with Martha when I watched the show. I identified with Martha in a way that I hated. I would never do anything so extreme as what she did, but I did text my ex 12 times with no response after he abruptly ended it. At first, I employed apologies and pathos to get him to answer. Then, over text, I was short of working out how I felt about him. Then over text, I was sort of working out how I felt about him and the relationship. Then eventually I got angry in the text. And then he blocked me, unsurprisingly. Okay, I just want to go over this. So you say that he abruptly ended it, and then you texted him 12 times with no response. So the first 4 texts, you were apologizing and expressing pathos, feelings. You're like, hey, please answer me. Then there were 4 more texts of you saying you're trying to work out how you felt about him in the relationship. So maybe something like, well, maybe this is for the best or whatever. But then there's 4 more texts where you're angry, like, fuck you, how dare you, you're not responding or whatever. Or you always were a jerk face or what, I don't know. And then you say that he blocked you, unsurprisingly. And, I don't know the situation, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw the texts or if we talked to him, would he say that he abruptly ended it? But maybe he did, maybe he did. Maybe he just, everything was cruising along and all of a sudden he's like, yeah, I'm breaking up. And then boom, he blocks you. Like, yeah, it's going to cut. So I could be hearing a very normal response from you, patron, but we'd have to hear the full story. Going on with the email. So he blocked me, unsurprisingly. All I really wanted, short of getting back together or even just being friends, was some sort of closure, some recognition from him that I'm human and that he hurt me. But I also understand it probably made him feel unsafe and smothered. Okay. End of email. You're saying that you feel resentful of me when I characterize preoccupied people as holding avoidant people hostage. I won't, I don't know what went on with you and your boyfriend. I do know me, and I apologize to you if I said that or hinted at that or something. In all the content that I make, there's a lot of different contexts. Like there will be times when I'm speaking to a preoccupied person and I'll have a particular vibe. Another time I might be talking to someone who was abused by someone that we would characterize as preoccupied, and I'll speak in a different way. Or I might be watching a reality TV show in which someone is being preoccupied and I feel bad for them. And in another moment, I might be watching a reality TV show and seeing someone that's acting preoccupied that is being extremely abusive and annoying, and I'll be talking about preoccupied in a different vibe. So, there's probably a lot of vibes, and might I have been a dick at some point along the way. And I apologize for that if that's true. All right, this next email is from patron Emily from Denver. She asked a lot of questions about projective identification, which I very much love because that's one of my favorite things to talk about. But I don't want to get bogged down too much in theory. You can listen to my other episodes on that. But to answer your questions directly, yes, you can internalize both an outside relationship and you can also internalize a relationship that you're in. You internalize the object, your perception of the object. You also internalize your perception of the self, and that becomes a stable dyad internalization. And then you also say, does it apply to events later in life or only in childhood? Yes, we're always internalizing, but we're more of a sponge when we're young. In fact, therapy in my model is an internalization in a positive way. You're internalizing yourself, a version of yourself, and your therapist, and that's becoming a stronger, you're bolstering a positive interject inside of you. So there's that. Let's go on to another email. All right, this is another great email. Anonymous listener, she says, I just started watching your baby reindeer episodes, and you were talking about a corrective experience and how most of us have this compulsion to rewrite the past. For example, you talked about getting involved romantically with people that have similar traits to a parent so that we can rework the past. You said that sometimes it can be successful, but more often than not, we choose someone who won't change because we kind of need it to be that way. Would you be able to expand on that? Why do we need it to be that way? You did not elaborate, but I was really curious to know what you meant. Yeah, well, anonymous listener, in a nutshell, and this is largely psychobabble and unprovable, but it's a model of understanding weird human behavior. Psychodynamic theory is good for that. And this is my way of putting it. How do I say this very briefly? Let's just go with abandonment. So you have an abandoning father, and you learn a lesson that you are not worth sticking around for. And so you grow up in life, and you're struggling with that internally, and you're not super aware of it. I mean, you know your dad abandoned you, but you don't really know you're carrying it with you. You don't know how it affects you. You have this assumption that you're not a good person, you're not lovable. You have this assumption that other people can't really be trusted, and that other people are always trying to get away from you, whatever. It depends on the manifestation, but you get my point. And you're starting to date, and there's a subconscious need to try to recreate that past relationship because there's this desire to try to go back in time and make your dad not abandon you. And if you can date someone that kind of looks like your dad and has abandoning hints and qualities, and I can get him to not abandon me, then at least that's a vicarious solution to that problem that I want to correct for in the past. It's not actually taking a time machine, but it's close enough. This is a subconscious compulsion. Another reason for this is that we're just used to it. We loved our dad, and we will subconsciously look for qualities that we predict will produce that love feeling. And if we're not careful, we'll just sniff out the guy in the room who actually has the signs of someone who would abandon you. So some of it is just the devil that kind of thing. Also, we might recreate it because we believe deep down that we're abandonable, and why fight it? We should just be with someone who abandons people because it's going to happen anyway, that kind of thing. Going on with another email. Anonymous long-term middle tier patron, they say, watching Baby Reindeer triggered me pretty hard in an unexpected way. I related so thoroughly to Donnie. The part where he realizes he's part of the problem and he realizes that he's complicit in his own abuse. I remember realizing that too. Yeah, that, I don't know if there's anything that I've ever seen that shows that element at all, let alone that well. Yeah, you say the part he realized he's part of the problem, and he realizes that he's complicit in his own, he's not complicit in his own abuse. That's how he felt about it. He's not to blame. He's not complicit. He's just trying to survive. But you could see how someone would think that going on. I remember realizing that too, and the shame and the defeat I felt at the time. Yeah, just chiming in here. I don't know your situation, anonymous long-term middle tier patron, but it's not black or white. It's not I wasn't complicit or I was complicit. There's a third option, which is I was struggling to such a degree and looking for a solution under various rocks, and occasionally the rocks that I would overturn involved me leaning into the abuse and maybe trying to get a control of it by trying to create it or something. That's not complicit with the abuse. That's a desperate act by a desperate person. It'd sort of be like you're a hostage. Someone's got you at gunpoint, and you try various different things to avoid being shot. And one of the things you do is you start kissing up to the guy with the gun. Well, you're not complicit in the gun being in your face. You're just desperately looking for a way to survive. And that's the way it looked to me. And I actually felt bad for Donnie that the way the character was written, he was concluding that he was to blame. All I saw was someone that was just scrambling for solutions to a very difficult situation. And everyone does that going on. It's been almost a year since that revelation, and I'm still working with a therapist. I've been kind of hibernating because I don't trust myself. I see that I'm my worst enemy. Even with therapy, I'm not so confident. I'm like Donnie, going out every day pretending to be fine, strong, and normal. End of email. Yeah, well, patron, I'm so sorry that you went through this. You're better off now than you were before, but you're in that zone where Donnie was. There's another zone where you don't conclude. You say it like, I realized it too. I remember when I realized that I was complicit in the abuse. That's just another version of internalized abuse for yourself. You weren't complicit. And to conclude that and stay in that place, and it's fine if that's just a stage, but to stay in that place that you're to blame, essentially, for the abuse, will lead to what you're talking about, where you believe you're your own worst enemy. You were harmed by somebody else. This is very important, and there's no way to completely convince oneself of this over time, but you got to work on it. The abuser did something to you, and you were innocent. You've always been innocent, and you were just trying to survive. Maybe there were times when, like with Donnie, you created it somehow, but that's how trauma is. That's what it does to us. So the fact that you feel defeated and that you don't trust yourself, that you're not confident, keep going to therapy, keep working on it. But the place that you deserve to be is a place where you look back and say, like, oh my God, I was trying my best, and I didn't have particularly good guidance, or I didn't have the time to think or to ask for help. And I was scrambling because I was suffering like anyone else would have in that position. And I regret doing X, Y, and Z, but I don't think I was a bad person, because what else are you going to do when you got a gun pointed at your face? You're going to do some weird shit. The bottom line is that I was targeted by someone who was abusive, and they harmed me, and I was just trying anything to get out of it. That's what Donnie was going through. Donnie was one of the most abused people we've ever seen in any kind of show or movie. And if he's going to have a few weird reactions, it's understandable, right? And he had a lot of healthy reactions, including, if this is a true story, making the TV show. All right, last email here. Patron Sarah in France, she says, I watched Baby Reindeer on Netflix and found it extremely triggering due to my previous experience of having been sexually abused in my teens. Yeah. Honestly, if I had known it was that dark, I probably wouldn't have watched it. Just chiming in. Yeah, I think I said at the very beginning of my first video that people should be very careful watching this show. If ever there's a show that requires a trigger warning for people with PTSD, this is that show. So, yeah. So going on with the email. However, I almost immediately segued from Netflix into your podcast episode, and I found it to be very soothing to relive the experience of watching the show with your commentary. Hearing your voice and how you unpacked the characters was very insightful and healing for me, and helped me to ground myself. I'm not sure if you make reaction content with this express purpose in mind, but in this instance, I found it really helpful, and it made me feel able to carry on going about my day rather than collapsing in on myself. So thank you for sharing your perspective and for all the hard work you put into the podcast. You're truly a good person. Wow. Sarah in France, thanks. That last sentence is the nicest thing anyone can say to me, honestly. But anyway, yeah, sorry you went through that. I'm sorry you went through the original PTSD, the original traumas. I'm sorry that you got triggered. I'm glad that I was able to help in my small way. And I don't make my reaction content specifically for that, but I have heard that from people before, because it's weird, it's like, well, watching this show by myself makes me feel this bad way, but then when I watch it and then Kirk interrupts and then yammers for a while, it doesn't feel as bad. I guess if I said I had an overarching reason why I make reaction videos, is that, well, I guess there are two things. One is I'm trying to increase compassion for self and others through modeling and understanding, conceptualizing people in a way that will drive compassion and thus drive compassion for the self. But I also am trying to validate people's experiences. I'm trying to say that right there, I've seen many times, and that, or I've been through that myself. I think a lot of content makers will have that as a purpose, right? And that's why I turn to stuff, I watched Rebel Moon 2 the other day, and I couldn't believe how bad that movie was. I wanted to like it. I actually kind of liked Rebel Moon 1, contrary to everyone around me. Everyone hated, they hate everything that Zack Snyder does, right? But Rebel Moon, the movie on Netflix, 1, I tried to be as open as possible, and I was like, yeah, it wasn't that bad. 6 out of 10. It's watchable. It's fine. It's not as bad as everyone says it. And I had to defend it to everybody, be like, hey, Rebel Moon, hating Rebel Moon isn't a personality or something. And then I watched Rebel Moon 2, and I'm thinking, it's a continuation of the story. It's probably just as good as the last one, right? No, Rebel Moon 2, I can't, especially if you've seen Rebel Moon 1. Rebel Moon 2 is quite possibly the dumbest script, and I've seen some dumb scripts. I've seen The Room. I've seen episode 9, and Rebel Moon 2 is, I just can't even believe how bad it is. And I wasn't traumatized, but I did want to feel not alone. And so I went to YouTube, and I'm not alone. And you're not alone. And I don't know if I'll do any more episodes about Baby Reindeer. I somehow I doubt it. But what a journey, right? Well, maybe something will come up. I don't know. It's not on the docket. But if you're still listening to this or watching this, what a journey this show has taken us on, and all the things that have happened. It's quite a thing. It's like the Tiger King moment, or the Love is Blind season 1 moment. These TV events, often on Netflix, that just, get us going, get us talking, get us thinking. Think about all the emotions that everyone has been through, even in these emails in response to the show. And yeah, I'm getting chills thinking about when I was watching that first episode, and I was like, oh my God, this show is so good. I mean, regardless of the topic, which also is very engaging, just the style and the story and the acting and the directing. And I can't believe that Richard Gadd directed this. I can understand why he wrote it, because he was already a playwright, right? I understand why he is a good actor, because, again, he was on stage. But directing with camera is, it's a whole other world. And there are very specific directing choices. I mean, nothing mind-blowing, but very specific directing choices that aren't obvious and cheesy, but extremely effective. Like, there's this one scene early on, I think episode 1, where Donnie comes around the corner at the bar, and he sees Martha sitting at the bar, and Martha is looking very, very sad. When Donnie is around, Martha's very animated and happy. But when Donnie kind of sneaks a look at her when he's not around, and she's just left to herself, and she's just staring at, eyes cast down, she looks miserable. And the way that scene is shot, and the voiceover and the lighting changes and the zoom, and I don't know, it's not mind-blowing, but it's very, very effective. And when the first time I watched the show, I didn't really recognize any of those things. Upon rewatching it, I recognized these edits and these shots and these sequences and the choreography or the staging. Like that scene in the canal, it's just so specific. That scene where I'm getting chills, where they're joking around, this is later on, and she says, she's hugging him, and she says, I just wish I could unzip you all the way down through your belly, and I could just crawl inside you. And the line that Richard Gadd, the writer, director, actor, rides in between, because, it's hinting at like Silence of the Lambs, right? But it's not going completely in that direction. There's another part where you, at the same time, you feel the pain and the innocence in Martha's desire to crawl inside someone. It sounds like, at least to me, the way a child would long to be held, to be taken care of. So in the same expression, which is just masterful, really, and fits these kinds of scenarios of stalking, where you have in the same moment, in the same person, someone is being fragile and childlike, and you feel bad for them. At the same time, they're talking about skinning you alive and getting inside of your skin and walking around with your skin on like a skin suit. And it's terrifying. The fact that Richard Gadd several times in the series could have these scenes that could hold all of that, and that's so hard to do. It's just so incredibly hard to do. Like that scene where he makes the joke about the curtains and the way the voiceover is and the sequence and everything, like he's got a keen eye for how people interact and the way things feel and why people do things. There's so many reasons why the show works. And it's numerous things, it's not just, the show isn't a one-trick pony. I worry that people will just characterize it as, oh, that's the show about the stalkers. That show could have been about anything. That show could have been about anything, and it still would have been entertaining. It wouldn't have been as compelling in all likelihood, but it was just a good show. I could, that first half of that first episode of the actress Jessica something and Richard Gadd, and the way it was written, everything, I could have watched that forever. The way that they were interacting, the believability of it, and the empathy that I'm having for the characters. And I don't know, there are historical moments sometimes centering around a TV show, and I think we just witnessed one, and I'm glad to have been swept up by that thing. Maybe more things will happen. Maybe in the future it'll come out that Richard Gadd was lying about the whole thing and Fiona is completely innocent. Well, I mean, maybe. Doesn't seem likely, but all right, well, that does it for that episode of Psychology Seattle. Everyone out there, please, please, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do. And thanks for the emails.